and welcome. I'm Miriam, co-founder and CEO of Babbly. This is our first episode from a series of interviews where I speak with experts in the world of child development and ask them questions that I struggled to find straightforward answers to as a first-time parent. Monika, I'm very, very excited to have you. This is our first series of expert interviews, and I could not have asked for a better guest to host on our interview series. So I've obviously, lots of people know you in the field, but I wanted to give a quick introduction about you, so people who are going to watch it will know a little bit more about yourself, and then you can add anything that I missed on top of that. So Monika, you're a lecturer at University of Toronto Speech-Language Pathology Department. You received your PhD from the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders at McGill University in Canada. Previous to joining U of T as a lecturer, you completed your postdoc at Basque Center for Cognition, or BCBL in Spain. Over there, your research focused on how young children and infants who learn Spanish and or Basque adapt to a bilingual or monolingual environment at the neutral cognitive and behavioral levels. I hope I pronounced the language correctly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. So anything else? I guess let's start by maybe introducing yourself. Tell us about your background, where you were born. This is meant to be very informal. Anything you wanted to tell to give more context about yourself and your background.
Absolutely, and thank you very much for a very nice and comprehensive introduction. So my name is Monika Molnar. Actually, I was born in Hungary, and I did my undergrad there. And then I became very interested in second language acquisition research. And that's how I found an amazing PhD program at McGill in Montreal. And this is where I did my PhD. And at the very beginning, I was more interested in, as I said, like second language acquisition. But then later on, throughout my PhD, I became very much interested in bilingual first language acquisition, meaning like how the mind develops when we acquire two languages pretty much from birth. So I became very interested in simultaneous bilinguals. And after completing my PhD at McGill, I did a postdoctoral research stay in Spain, in northern Spain. And actually, northern Spain is a bilingual community with Spanish Basque bilinguals. So that complemented my work, my PhD work with English-French bilinguals very well. Then, after completing my postdoc in Spain, I moved to Toronto, where I am right now, and here I started a faculty position. And what is great about Toronto is that it is full of bilinguals and full of all different types of bilinguals with many different language combinations. So this is a fantastic place for bilingualism research.
That's great. Yeah, we definitely live in a very multilingual, cultural, and lingual environment. So I just want to go back to Hungary, where you were born. As someone growing up, did you ever think that you're going to end up doing what you're doing? Like, what got you interested in language?
Absolutely not. So during my undergrad studies, I became very interested in linguistics per se. And I did my undergrad in psychology and linguistics at the end. And then I just became very interested in, as I said, originally second language acquisition. And actually I did an undergrad honors thesis in Hungary. And so Hungary is primarily a monolingual country. Like most people grew up learning Hungarian. And most of the research in Hungary, when it comes to second language acquisition, it focuses on how Hungarians, for instance, they learn English or how they learn a second language. But my honors thesis focused on how people who come to Hungary learn Hungarian. So I did a little study on that. And then, as I said, just one thing led to another, and here we are.
That's fascinating. I definitely am not going to try to speak Hungarian. How many languages do you speak now?
I actually don't think I speak that many, but I definitely understand more. Like, I would say I speak Hungarian and English, a little bit of French, maybe a little bit of Spanish, but I do understand Spanish. I do understand Basque. Like, Basque is a very difficult language to learn. Like, I wouldn't even say that I understand Basque. I recognize some things in Basque at the moment. Yeah.
Okay, sounds awesome. So why don't you start telling us a little bit about your research? What is the key research question that your work is trying to answer and investigate?
So I'm interested in bilingual development across the lifespan. So I'm very much interested in how being immersed, exposed to two languages from birth or from very early childhood, how it changes your mind. And when I say your mind, I pretty much mean cognition as we think about it within psychology. And what fascinates me about the bilingual acquisition is that learning two languages from birth takes pretty much the same effort as learning one language. So when we compare the language development of monolingual and bilingual children, we see that they reach the developmental milestones of language and cognitive development pretty much at the same pace. And maybe there are some differences, like teeny tiny differences between monolingual and bilingual acquisition. But overall, it takes the same amount of time. And as I said, like, one of my main questions that I am interested in is, how is it possible that learning two languages is so easy for children? And I focus on two aspects of this question. One of them is like, so one of the hypotheses that I'm working on is whether being exposed to two languages leads to calibrating cognitive development in a way that maybe bilinguals, putting it in a simple way, they allocate more attentional resources to language learning as opposed to monolinguals, and maybe this is something that enables them to pick up and learn two languages so easily. And the other question that I'm interested in is whether bilinguals, they use any contextual cues when they are learning languages, because there is one thing that bilingual children have to do that monolingual children never have to do, is bilingual children, they have to switch between the two languages. They have to know when to use which language. And it's not such a straightforward process. It takes up a lot of cognitive resources just to being able to activate the right language at the right moment. And we know that bilinguals, they can use different cues, contextual cues, just to make this process easier. And I have a line of research that focuses on whether bilingual children and bilingual adults, they use interlocutors, like conversational partners, as cues. What I mean by is that, as soon as they recognize a familiar face, they just automatically shift into a language context. Because they know that, yes, that person speaks that language, but the other person speaks another language. So that is a teeny tiny cue that I have a couple of studies showing that within 200 milliseconds, which is just 1/5 of a second, you recognize a familiar face and you're ready to activate the appropriate language. And this is another area that I'm interested in. I've been looking at this in adults, and at the moment I'm looking at this in children, how early on they can use these kind of contextual cues to activate the appropriate language. Because as I said, this is a big question in bilingualism research, how we manage to juggle like several languages in our mind. And as I said, it is a big question because we do know that it is a big cognitive effort.
That's fascinating. So one thing I heard you say is being a bilingual is almost the same effort as being a monolingual. But at the same time, sounds like bilinguals or multilinguals have to do a lot of processing to understand contextual cues, as you said it, and make sure that they're switching to the right language. So, how does that make sense? It sounds like it's actually a lot more effort.
Yes. So why I'm interested in, because I think it takes pretty much the same amount of time to learn one language as opposed to two languages. But what goes into learning two languages, exactly as you just said, seems to be more effort than what goes into learning one language, at least to learn how to use two languages. And this is why we have this theory that we are testing in my lab, that maybe bilinguals, they just calibrate the attentional system differently than monolinguals. So that's how they are able to accommodate two languages in the environment.
Wow, that's really interesting. So one thing that makes me wonder is whether bilingual or monolingual children, because they have to learn the process of reading the contextual cues, is there any research or evidence that they're better at reading contextual cues across the board, whether it's language related or related to visual synthesis or making sense of the world, I guess?
Yeah, oh, I think that's an amazing question. I think it's a very important question. And I think the field at the moment do not have a definite answer to this. So how bilinguals use contextual cues, this type of research is very recent. So we just begin to understand that, oh, okay, bilinguals, they actually use people, like familiar faces as cues. But this research has just started. But then there is a bigger question that is very, very heatedly debated at the moment in the field, is whether this idea that bilinguals, they have to switch languages all the time, like, does that translate to a more general bilingual cognitive advantage? So in other ways, just because bilinguals, they have to switch between their languages all the time, and they have to activate the appropriate language, whether this leads to a more general cognitive advantage in bilinguals is currently heatedly debated. Like, there is just as many studies showing that being bilingual leads to a general cognitive advantage. There are just as many showing this point as many studies we have showing that there is not really a cognitive advantage associated with being bilingual. And I think it's a very, very, very interesting question. And maybe now where the field is going is to understand under what circumstances bilingualism leads to advantages. So maybe it's the age of acquisition or the proficiency level, or under what context we use language that could have like a more positive effect on cognition in general. But as I said, like, that is currently a very much debated topic in bilingualism research.
So it sounds like there is one camp or studies that support the idea of bilingualism could be an advantage in terms of development, and the other one which doesn't necessarily support that idea. I'm wondering if there are any studies or anyone that thinks that actually multilingualism is bad for.
Okay, excellent question. There is absolutely no studies showing that bilingualism has a disadvantage or that bilingualism is bad for you. Even when it comes to children who grow up with a developmental disorder. For instance, like, we get many questions from parents whose children been diagnosed with a developmental disorder. And from research so far, we know that being exposed to two languages from an early age, even if a child has a developmental disorder, has no negative effects whatsoever. So what is important all the time, no matter if you have a typically developing child or a child with a developmental disorder, is the amount of language that the child is exposed to. Clearly, the more the better. having more communicative interactions, rich interactions like that includes lots of language, different communicative interactions, even if it is within one language or across two languages, it is really the quantity and the amount that a child is exposed to matters. And it's not whether it is one or more languages.
Really interesting. So I guess one of the myths potentially around bilingualism is that it causes delay. And in a lot of cases, when especially parents who have concerns and share that concern, whether it's with their physicians or others, we might hear the fact that, you know, there's more than language, that's why your child is meeting those milestones. Can you unpack that a little? Is there any reason why we should believe that a child who's exposed to 3 languages might, you know, meet those developmental milestones later than it
so if we have any reasons to believe that being exposed to 3 languages would lead to like a bit slowed down development, is
sorry, whether multilingual children reach the milestones later than monolingual children.
I see what you mean. So what we know that overall they reach like this linguistic and cognitive milestones pretty much around the same time. But we know that there could be maybe like on average a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months of delay. So this is what research shows so far, that it's a very good trade-off in terms of what you learn and the time it takes you to learn. Because as I said, like most things, like the onset of the first words, like the onset of the first words is typically between 11 and 14 months of age in monolingual children. And it's exactly the same in bilingual, multilingual children. They produce their first words around at the same time frame. Children normally begin to produce very short sentences during the second year of life. It's the same for monolinguals and bilinguals. So all these very important milestones, they happen at the same time across monolinguals and bilinguals. Now I know that sometimes I speak to parents or I speak to SLPs who say that, oh, I know someone whose child is exposed to, like, who's learning 3 languages, the child is like 13 months of age and still not saying a word. Does it mean anything? And all I can say that it happens to a lot of monolingual children too. So there's a lot of monolingual 13-month-olds out there who do not say their first words yet. So of course there could be some language delay, but it is just as common across monolinguals and bilinguals. So it might be a little bit of confirmation bias that, you know, when we see that, this child is exposed to like 3 languages and not saying a word yet, oh, it's because this child is learning 3 languages. And it is very likely that it's not the reason for that delay, because as I said, like, this kind of delay is just as common in monolinguals as in bilinguals.
That sounds great. So let's go back to the idea of quantity of language, where you said, you know, the more language a child is exposed to, the better. What about the quality? What determines quality? And maybe I'll let you to start with that. The follow-up.
That is a very good question. And when I said that, oh, the quantity matters so much, I try to emphasize that it's also the context in which you use the language, which means like the quality, how we use the language matters too. Like when it comes to quality, and when we interact with our children, it is important to be responsive. It's not just like, you know, giving a monologue to the child and just tell something to the child and then not really caring about how the child responds or if the child has anything to say, but it is just to kind of scaffold these kind of conversations, this kind of conversation structure. So asking meaningful follow-up questions from children, or just to try to prompt them as well to speak. And as I said, to be responsive. So if the child is asking a question or if the child needs anything, then just always show that we are as caregivers able to respond, and ideally we are able to respond with language as well. And then later in the development, like after like 3-4 years of age, it is very important to for the child to become familiar with literacy. Of course, it is very early for children to begin to learn around age 3 and 4, but it is very important to use books or to use any media where we can point, where we can show that, oh, there is a text, there is a print, and that print is meaningful. We can read that print because in this way, the child gets used to this idea that there is a relationship between literacy and language. And around age 4 and 5, many children, they are able to recognize some letters, they are able to recognize some symbols, maybe they can write their own name. So also just interacting with your child in this sense that you are encouraging literacy, you are encouraging book use, or using of any kind of printed media is, I think, is also a very important part of language development. And why it is important is because many children, when they begin to attend school and they get to that stage that they have to learn to read, this is where we diagnose many children with language disorders. And this is when we realize that they need extra support. So that's why just introducing literacy as early as possible is also, in my opinion, is part of a good quality language input when it comes to the home settings.
Great tip. One of the things, Monika, that I think when we first met, I was fascinated by was this idea of the fact that babbling is universal. And I remember, I had to ask you a couple of times that really are, like, even Japanese and Arabic babies go through the same stages, and it was shocking to me. And every time I bring this up, people seem fascinated by the idea. Can you talk a little bit about that? How is babbling and pre-verbal communication skills universal or different across cultures and languages?
As I guess most of us know, babies, as soon as they are born, they begin to make like different noises, like crying, grunts, and so on. And later on, in about like 3-4 months, these so-called vocalizations that babies do, they become more and more speech-like. Now, what I mean by speech-like, that beginning around 4 months of age, they begin to sound like maybe vowels or consonants. And we have research showing that beginning around 6 months of age, all these kind of vowel-like or consonant-like sounds or babbles that babies produce, they begin to sound more and more like the language that is spoken in the baby's environment. So one way to think about this is that babies, they already around 6 months of age, they begin to imitate what they hear. So they do not necessarily attach meaning to everything that they hear and to everything that they try to produce, but they produce more, like we call it, native-like babbles. So an English learning baby around 6-8 months of age would more likely produce like vowels and consonants that resemble English sounds. And then Japanese learning babies around this age, they would more likely produce vowels and consonants that resemble Japanese. Now, of course, they do not exactly sound like Japanese sounds, or they do not exactly sound like English sounds, but they begin to sound like. So the babbling, like if we recorded like an 8 months old English learning infant's babble, and we would record an 8 months old Japanese learning infant's babble, and we would compare them in terms of the acoustic characteristics, we would see big differences. And we would say that a Japanese baby babbles more like Japanese, and an English learning infant babbles more like English.
Okay, so sounds like, uh, correct me if I understood it right, but the acoustic characteristics are different, but the type of structure and the way.
Oh, yeah, of course, there is also that. So I was just focusing on single sounds when I was talking about babbling earlier, but of course, babbles can be longer too than just one vowel and one consonant. So there are syllables that babies produce too when they babble. And we know that these so-called phonotactic properties of English and Japanese, for instance, they are different. Like, um, um, it's more common to have like um, consonants at the beginning of a syllable in English as opposed to in Japanese. So it is more likely that an English learning baby would produce more consonants at the beginning of a syllable as opposed to a Japanese learning infant. And also even the length of these babbles could be different depending on the type of the language that the baby is exposed to.
So, what are some similarities across cultures? You mentioned the differences. What makes babbling universal across languages?
That's such a good question because you know what, like I kind of dedicate my research like understanding the differences, but you know the similarities. It's such a good question. Well, the similarity is the onset of babbling. That these kind of speech-like babbles, they probably, in most cases or in most babies, they begin to emerge around 6 months of age. And there's also research showing that even bilingual babies, like Swedish English bilingual babies, I think this study came out from Sweden, where they showed that Swedish monolingual and Swedish bilingual babies, they began to babble at the same age. Just going back to the bilingualism question earlier. So that's something universal, the age at which babies begin to babble.
So, if we were going to compare two children from two different cultural backgrounds and language environments, would it be fair to expect them reach the same babbling milestone in terms of syllables structure around the same time? Like, you know,
Yes.
single syllable, canonical, variegated.
Yes, absolutely. So I would say that depending, exactly, so in principle, the type of language that the babies learn should not affect the onset of these, as you said, babbling. Yeah, so I would expect the same.
Sounds fascinating. Anything else you wanted to add that I should have asked or wanted to add that's related to your area of research or anything you wanted our audience to hear?
Well, just in summary, because bilingual development is my specialty, so just to emphasize that learning more than one language from birth is never disadvantageous. It's just an advantage at the end of the day, because even if there is a bilingual cognitive advantage associated with bilingualism or no bilingual cognitive advantage associated with bilingualism, no matter what, the child will grow up, you know, speaking, using two languages. The child will be familiar with two different cultures, and so bilingualism is great. That would be the bottom line of my message today.
Multilingualism is good, people.
Yeah, that's it.
Children in different languages, if you can.
Yes.
It's a gift. Great. So at the end, before I let you go, I wanted to ask, is there any podcast, book, any article, any resource that you would recommend, whether it's to parents or fellow researchers and people in academia?
Nothing from the top of my head at the moment. Sorry.
That's
Because,
okay.
yeah.
You
but
can,
I can email you some resources.
yeah,
later.
and I can just put it in our social channels as I share this conversation. Monika, it was a pleasure talking to you. I I'm learning every time I speak to you. Today I learned about contextual cues, and I'm sure that our audience will also find this conversation really interesting. Good luck, all the best, and
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. It was great to see you, and it was
thank you.
great to spend some time with you. And then I talk to you another time.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Have a good day.
Take care. Bye.